Adriaan is coming to us from Leeds, the headquarters of what used to be called the Colonial Project. But it is no longer the Colonial Project. So over to you, Adriaan.
Thank you, Divine, for this very kind introduction. I'm not sure how to live up to this expectation of the headquarters of the Colonial Project, but thank you so much, Divine and Isabella, for the invitation to present here. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm a little intimidated by my three previous speakers who did an excellent job in introducing us to some of the complex questions that we are facing here. And I've been asked to talk about the question of African knowledges. And let me share my screen because I put together a few slides. So I am going to resist Samia's invitation or challenge to talk about SDGs rather than SDGs, because I've only been given 10 minutes to talk about the subject that has been allocated to me. So the question of African knowledges for sustainable development, and just to be to manage your expectations, this is a question that, of course, I have been thinking about for a longer time since I started doing research in African contexts. But at the same time, it is a kind of subject that I've only started recently thinking about more systematically as part of a conversation that we have initiated at the Leeds University Center for African Studies about the question of African knowledges. So where some of my previous speakers have presented very provocative presentations, I will be sharing some of the views and surveying some of the key literature and sharing some of the key ideas that other thinkers have developed, which are much ahead of where I am in this journey. So why thinking about African knowledges? The conversation we are having at Leeds around this question was inspired by the observation that in many research areas and academic disciplines that are not kind of historically connected or part of African studies as a field, there has in recent years been a kind of emerging interest and engagement with the African continent. And to a considerable extent, that new research interest in Africa is inspired and is driven by the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals that has already been deconstructed by the first speaker, Eliseo. And especially in the UK context, the funding scheme related to the SDG agenda of the Global Challenges Research Fund. And there is a risk with this new kind of engagement with Africa that some of the problems that have haunted African studies as a field for a long time, that some of these problems are kind of reinforced and are coming up again and are repeated in the current engagement with Africa in our universities. And to summarize that problem in one kind of term, it is the risk of the Africa as deficit model, where Africa is the place of all kind of problems, such as related to development, and the developmental agenda has already been challenged today, and where Western theory and Western knowledge is conceived of as presenting the solutions to address or to even solve these problems. So the question that we started to ask ourselves at Leeds was, what are the lessons that can be learned from the debate around decolonizing African studies, and how can we engage this whole debate around decolonization again in relation to this kind of new interdisciplinary engagement with Africa? How can we start theorizing from Africa rather than imposing preconceived Western ways of thinking and theorizing on African contexts? And of course, it is important to remind us that this whole question of African knowledges is part of a much broader kind of field of scholarship and literature, in which the West has been decentered as, or at least where the assumption that the West is the center of knowledge production and of theorizing has been challenged. And of course, there's a long tradition of post-colonial literature and theorizing that has challenged the Western gaze towards the colonized or the formerly colonized world and its subjects. So in recent years, Rabin Connell published their book, Southern Theory, which was already alluded to briefly earlier. And Connell in that book takes a kind of relational approach to knowledge production, analyzing, and it relates to some of the previous speakers, how intellectuals and institutions in the metropole and those in the periphery, how they are connected, and the kind of relationships, the power relationships that embed the knowledge production, relationships of authority, of exclusion and inclusion, hegemony, partnership, sponsorship, appropriation, different modes of managing those relationships through which knowledge is produced. A couple of years ago, Jean and John Komarov published their book, Theory from the South, which has quite an explicit Africa focus, in which they take issue with what they call Euro-modernity, in which modernity is defined by the European Enlightenment. And the starting point of their book is actually really interesting, I think, that the Global South in general, and Africa in particular, affords, in their words, privileged insight into the workings of the world at large. So their kind of premise in this book is that theorizing from Africa can actually provide relevant insights, not just in understanding African realities, but in global realities, including in the global north. And maybe the COVID-19 pandemic provides us with a unique opportunity to do that. On the back of those kind of debates around decolonizing knowledge production, in the 1990s, there was an emerging discourse around indigenous African knowledges. And as the word indigenous knowledge already suggests, in this discourse, there is a strong emphasis on indigeneity, knowledge that originates from African contexts. And in much of the literature around this concept of African indigenous knowledge, it is conceived of as an experiential form of knowledge that is embedded in culture, that is embedded in cultural memory, and that can be kind of reclaimed through oral history. There's also a strong idea that African indigenous knowledge has certain ethical values, which are often described in terms of wholeness, community, and harmony. And much of the whole discourse around Ubuntu, for example, as an ethical value, as a philosophical concept, reflects this idea of Ubuntu as a kind of key concept in African indigenous knowledge that can be utilized to address contemporary challenges. Of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa is an important case study, but Sylvia Tamale introduces and uses the concept of Ubuntu in her most recent book around decolonizing African feminism as well. So it is used to address questions and to think through questions of gender and knowledge of gender in African contexts. Now, this concept of indigenous knowledge has been challenged and critiqued by other scholars because it has the kind of connotation that African knowledge is static, is isolated, is part of tradition rather than of modernity. So these are some of the kind of criticisms that have been made of the concept of African indigenous knowledges. And in their book, Africa-Centered Knowledge, Brenda Cooper and Robert Morell coin an alternative term, Africa-Centered Knowledges. And their starting point in this book is that the African continent should be conceptualized as multiple. So to avoid this idea of Africa as a country, we need to acknowledge the multiplicity of African realities. The African continent is conceptualized as global, as embedded in global relationships, not just as global in the kind of recent history, but as African knowledge has always been part of global processes of exchange. And Africa is conceptualized as a dynamic continent instead of this idea of static African tradition. And Cooper and Moreau propose Africa-centered knowledges as a thinking about knowledge in Africa as being entangled, as being contextual, and as being contingent. And they make the claim that Africa-centered knowledges is not about the question where knowledge originates from. It is not about indigeneity, but it is about knowledge that literally they claim that any form of knowledge can become Africa-centered by being entangled with African realities. And in their proposal, Africa-centered knowledge are a kind of third space between Eurocentric knowledge and Afrocentric knowledge, by opening up a more kind of hybrid space to think through the question of knowledge production and in African contexts that is relevant to and that engages with African cultural and social and political contexts and worldviews. So indigenous knowledge, African-centered knowledge, these are some of the key concepts to think through this question of what counts as knowledge and as proper knowledge. And of course, there's a whole set of political questions around that. Not only political questions, but also epistemological questions. And the key thinker that I'd like to briefly introduce here to you is Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni, who in several books has engaged the question of African knowledge from a radical decolonial perspective. So in his book, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, he introduces the concept of epistemicide to argue that the colonial project, whether or not it is a project, has been questioned by the first speaker already, but the European project was engaged in an active killing of indigenous people's knowledges. And if it wasn't an active killing, then it was a more passive, but still highly impactful process of silencing and marginalizing and excluding indigenous knowledges. So epistemicide as a kind of really critical concept to think through the question of knowledge and the production of knowledge. He also coins the concept of epistemic justice, which I think is really critical because it reminds us that this whole question of knowledge fundamentally is a question of justice. And he coins epistemic justice as a liberation of reason itself from coloniality, to a liberation that opens up multiple ways of thinking about knowledge and producing knowledge, and also acknowledging that different forms of wisdom and knowledge can be recognized as proper knowledge. So the argument that he is making in his book is for epistemic freedom, the right to think, theorize, interpret the world, develop own methodologies, and write from where one is located and unencumbered by Eurocentrism. In his latest book, which, to be honest, I haven't yet read because it was only just published, Decolonization, Development and Knowledge in Africa, Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni applies some of these concepts, these epistemological questions, to the question of development. And it sounds like this is in the interest of many of the people in this group who have a kind of interest, critical interest in development and the whole concept of development. So to conclude, the question of knowledge and the question of the possibility of African knowledges, of indigenous knowledge, of Africa-centered knowledge reminds us basically that there is a plurality of knowledge. And the question, what form of knowledge are seen as proper academic or proper scientific, is of course a political one, is a question of power, is about power imbalances and inequalities. A number of decolonial thinkers have recently argued, further elaborating on this question of multiple knowledges, have recently proposed the concept of the pluriversity instead of the university, which is in their kind of critique based on a notion of universal, of one form of universal knowledge. So Achille Mbembe, in a recent essay, conceptualizes the pluriversity as a process of knowledge production that is open to epistemic diversity, to the recognition of multiple forms of knowledge and knowledge production. It is a process that does not necessarily abandon the notion of universal knowledge for humanity, but which embraces it via a horizontal strategy of openness to dialogue among different epistemic traditions. And I'm really fascinated by this concept of the pluriversity and what it means. Whether our universities are open enough, or how they can be opened up to the existence of different forms of knowledge that maybe are not necessarily based on a Western Eurocentric Enlightenment model of rationality, for example, or sovereignty and other Enlightenment principles. So, and of course, in different areas of work, the question of African knowledges will work out in different ways. There has been a whole debate in history, for example, whether an African history is possible and how that would look like. I work in the field of religion myself, and the question whether religious knowledge can be classified as a form of knowledge, and both in the terms of African indigenous religions, the ritual of divination, what kind of knowledge is produced there, and popular forms of Christianity on the continent, where Pentecostal pastors claim to receive the gift, to have the gift of prophecy. What form of knowledge does that represent? And how do we engage and interpret those forms of knowledge production? So in different forms in different academic disciplines, the question of African knowledge will play out in different ways. And we can continue the conversation around that, how that plays out in our own specific areas of research in the discussion that follows. So far, this very brief introduction to the question of African knowledges and the possibilities of that, which really is an invitation to think about knowledge as a creative, as a dynamic, as a diverse concept.
Thank you, Adriaan. Thank you for that very critical introduction to African knowledge systems.